Hi everyone, welcome to the first slide presentation for the course Foundations of Addiction Studies. These slides are for Chapter 1, Part 1, dealing with the 3 C's. In this presentation, we're going to talk about those 3 C's and why that's such an important way of understanding addiction throughout the course. We're going to take a look at some other definitions and terminology, a few historical events related to the development of addiction, as well as some data related to current usage rates. So first off, it's very important to get a real clear picture of what the 3 C's are. And you should find that throughout these slide presentations, the information supplements what you're reading about and what you're watching in the other videos and brings a lot of these concepts to life. So when we talk about addiction, our understanding is that addiction is a primary, chronic, and progressive brain disease or illness that's characterized by the following 3 C's, and you'll hear these used throughout the course. So the first C is compulsion. The second C is a loss of control. And the third C is consequences, especially using despite increasing consequences. On the next slide, we're going to talk about these in a little bit more detail. Now, when we think about addiction, we're mostly talking about substances of abuse like alcohol, cocaine, heroin. That's primarily what comes to people's mind. But if you look at that definition, and then if you look at the next couple of pictures, you'll see how that also ties in with other behaviors like compulsive shopping, compulsive gambling, compulsive internet use, and even sexual behavior. So from that last little summary that we talked about as far as the definition of addiction, we talked about it being a primary problem. That means that it's the main issue. It's something that needs treatment. It's deserving of focus all on its own. It's not just an underlying issue that's causing the addiction. There was a time where we figured that, addiction was just sort of the byproduct of maybe a mental illness or some other kind of life stressor. And so you really wanted to focus on the quote unquote root of the problem, which was the mental illness. We certainly know that people who have substance use disorders also have mental illness. We call that co-occurring disorders, and we see that all the time. However, you need to treat each of them as their own unique disorder. So addiction is a primary issue all on its own. It's also chronic, meaning that it is a long-term illness or disease. It's not something we can just treat with a quick fix. If you think about maybe breaking your leg, that would be an example of an acute injury, something that is incredibly painful. It needs immediate treatment. But once it's treated, there might be some long-term consequences, but essentially once your leg heals after a number of weeks, that's it. And then you don't have to keep continually treating that over and over. But if you think about an illness like diabetes or hypertension, these are chronic illnesses that don't just go away on their own, and they don't just go away with a short-term quick fix. Addiction is more like those chronic illnesses where we might treat it initially with an intense type of therapy, but it still needs long-term follow-up, and it still requires us to do things over a long period of time. We also look at it as a progressive illness. So if we don't do anything to treat it, it doesn't just heal or get better on its own. It tends to, in most cases, get worse over time. Now let's get back to those 3 C's because these are really great concepts, I think. So that first C is compulsion. And compulsion is an overwhelming urge to do something or to use a certain substance. You can think of it along the lines of an intense craving, and it's one that's so intense that even though you know it might be bad for you, you still just feel compelled to do it. That second C is the loss of control. And when we say loss of control, what we mean is you can no longer predict what's going to happen when you use. So if I start drinking, I can't accurately predict how much I'm going to drink. And I also can't predict what's going to happen when I've been drinking. So my intention might be to sit down and have 1 or 2 drinks, or at least I might tell myself that. But then 1 or 2 becomes 4 or 5, becomes 8 or 10, and then I've lost control at that point. And then I also don't know what my behavior is going to look like, what my thoughts, emotions, my actions are going to be when I am using that substance. So that's the loss of control piece. And the final C is also very important. This is about consequences. And if you're not sure about any of the other concepts or exactly how you can tell if somebody has an addiction or not, one pretty surefire way is to take a look at if a person has experienced consequences because of their drug use, but they continue to use and they don't make any changes. That's a really strong sign that there's an addiction there, that something's going on that needs more help. And those consequences can take several different forms. They can be physical consequences, emotional, financial, legal, interpersonal in our relationships, and even spiritual. So if you think about those being the 6 Al's, physical, emotional, financial, legal, interpersonal, and spiritual, you can remember what those different consequences look like. Now, moving off of that for just a couple of minutes here to talk about some of the major historical events that have taken place. And these are just a few significant things over time. Obviously, there's much more, and I encourage you to look into the history of addiction and the way it's been written about and treated in different societies. But we know that from ancient writings as far back at least as 3000 BC or BCE, we have societies who were using alcohol, who had religious rituals and community rituals, and even wrote stories and did paintings and drawings that included the use of alcohol. So that particular drug has been part of societies for many thousands of years, over 5,000 years. And it's interesting that over time in even different parts of the world, whether in the Middle East, in Asia, in Europe, in Africa, in North America, people had alcohol be part of their society, and they also had different kinds of rituals and stories and folklore around it. So it's been part of human culture for a long, long time. Going back just a little more recently than that, but to 2700 BC, there was written record of cannabis use. So that's another drug that's been around for a long time. Skipping several thousand years there, but moving into more recent times in the 1800s, we developed morphine as a pain treatment, a pain medication, which was especially useful in the military, also very useful for hospitals who were treating people with acute injuries. And morphine is still 200 years later is still very commonly used by hospitals. So this is one of the first kind of major pain medications that's widely used. If you go into the 1800s a little bit later, cocaine starts developing, becoming a very popular social and culturally accepted kind of drug. Sigmund Freud, in several of his books, wrote about using it, and there's other famous people of the time who were using it as well. It was considered to be a very safe drug. People felt, euphoric when they were using it. Even Coca-Cola, just like the Coke that we drink today, did use small amounts of cocaine in their formula at that time. At the end of the 19th century there in 1898, there started to be some recognition that some of these pain medications like opium and morphine were being misused. And so the Bayer Company came up with a drug that they thought would help people get off of morphine and would be a treatment for morphine addiction. And that drug was called heroin. And that drug was legal for a while. And yes, it turned out to be very effective to get people off morphine because it turns out to be a much more powerful version of morphine. It essentially metabolizes in our body the same way as morphine, but it's actually much more powerful. And we do, of course, still have a problem with heroin today. In 1914, there's a significant federal act, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act. During this time, there's a major push by states and by grassroots organizations to ban a lot of the common drugs that were being used at the time: cocaine, heroin, marijuana, and even alcohol, as we'll see with the 18th Amendment. So this act is related to trying to get illegal drugs, trying to get drugs to become illegal, and it's sort of the first push toward modern prohibition. In the 1920s, you may know that alcohol was prohibited. So the 18th Amendment was passed. There were groups that pushed for that to happen, that wanted to ban alcohol. Originally, there were several groups that wanted just to limit the use of alcohol and try to encourage moderate drinking. That was called the temperance movement. But the temperance movement really got swallowed up by the prohibition movement, which eventually outlawed alcohol for about a 10 to 12 year period of time. In 1937, there's an important federal act called the Marijuana Tax Act. It basically makes it impossible for anybody to own or possess marijuana and effectively makes that drug a prohibited drug, which by federal law, it still is today, almost 100 years later. In 1970, Richard Nixon was president. He's actually the one who created the Drug Enforcement Agency. If you've heard of drug scheduling, where drugs are put on different schedules, 1 through 5, he and his agency, his administration created that drug scheduling. And that's also when the modern war on drugs begins, which we're essentially 50 years plus into that war on drugs. During the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan was president, there was a major escalation of the war on drugs. A lot more money was put into it. Harsher criminal penalties were given out, particularly for people who possessed crack cocaine. A lot of efforts were being made to limit the influx of drugs from Central and South America as well. So this is when we really start trying to keep people from bringing drugs over the border. We even go into foreign countries and try to destroy some of their crops so that they couldn't produce those drugs and bring them into the United States. If you're familiar, at this time in the 1980s, there was a major campaign called the Just Say No campaign. And that's when DARE started as well. And that's when police officers and other community representatives would come to grade school classes and try to teach those children about the dangers of drugs. Finally, moving to the more recent times in the 2000s, we've had an interesting cultural shift where marijuana is now becoming legalized by several states. As I mentioned a minute ago, it's federally still illegal, and so that creates a bit of controversy. But a lot of states have moved toward legalizing it. It's become a much more accepted drug, which it was not in the past. So our attitudes are shifting around marijuana use. And we also have the modern opioid epidemic, where between a combination of painkillers, which have been overprescribed, and heroin use, we're seeing a large number of overdoses and people struggling with addiction. So I know that was a real lengthy kind of history and give you some of the highlights, but maybe give you some context for understanding how we got where we are today and how the laws and how cultural attitudes shape a lot of our relationship with drugs of abuse. Here's a couple other historical figures and groups that I wanted to point out. There's two images to look at. This is the first one. So going back to the early 1800s, Benjamin Rush was the first Surgeon General of the United States. He's also the first one who uses addiction to describe it as a disease and talk about it as a medical problem. Now, he proposed some kind of far out and archaic ways of treating addiction, but he was at least trying to recognize it as a disease and move toward ways of treating it. I mentioned before, if you remember, that there was a temperance movement that came around before the Prohibition movement. And this is around the mid-1800s. Think about the Wild West at this time and settlers kind of moving into large open areas of land. And a lot of those times, a lot of those areas had very little oversight, no police, maybe a local sheriff. There were saloons, and drinking was becoming a major problem in those communities. And some people started to recognize that heavy drinking, and they thought liquor in particular, needed to be outlawed or limited in some way because it was becoming a major problem. There was a group in the 1850s called the Washingtonians. They're somewhat similar to modern Alcoholics Anonymous. It was a group of people who I voluntarily identified having a problem with drinking, and they would kind of commit to being abstinent, and they would help each other in a self-help kind of manner. By the late 1800s, that temperance movement really was becoming more extreme and was looking more to promote abstinence and outlaw all alcohol. Susan B. Anthony was actually part of the Anti-Saloon League during this time in the late 1800s, which eventually gains enough momentum that, as you see in the 1920s, they actually pass a constitutional amendment to ban alcohol. Moving forward to the 1930s, actually 1935, Alcoholics Anonymous is founded, and it's the first 12-step group. They put out a really important text called the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And of course, it's still around today and has led to dozens of other 12-step self-help groups that have been very important in providing treatment for people that didn't exist before. So really prior to this time, therapists who tried to work with people who struggled with alcoholism had very few options and very few ideas of what they could do, and they weren't very successful. By the 1940s, an important researcher out of Yale University where he did a lot of his research through Yale, was E.M. Jelinek. And Jelinek really developed the modern disease concept of addiction as we know it today, and published a lot of work in the middle of the 20th century. By the 1950s, treatment centers were starting to open up, and one of the first major ones, which is still there today in Center City, Minnesota, was Hazelden. And they developed a model called the Minnesota model, and that's kind of where we get our 28-day program, where you do a residential kind of treatment, where you go through a detox period if needed, typically work the 12 steps, develop sober supports, and develop new coping skills for once you're back out into your community. In the 1980s and 90s, a guy by the name of William Miller developed a concept called motivational interviewing, and this has really become one of the best researched ways of working with addiction. And in even more recent times, the 90s and the 2000s, we've started to have good enough science and good enough brain imaging that we really can see what's going on in the brains of people with addiction and better understand the mechanisms by which addiction works. So this has changed our understanding significantly. It's also led to different types of treatment, a lot more medications to treat addiction, and a lot better modern understanding of what's happening with addiction. We also have during this time drug courts, which are now popping up all over the country and have been around for over 20 years. And drug courts are a way of keeping people out of prison, but encouraging them to get treatment. All right, so hopefully those gave you some idea, again, of the history and context in which we work today when it comes to addiction. Here's some additional data to provide a little more context as far as what's happening in the United States. So this information comes from SAMHSA and from NIDA. NIDA is the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Right now, over 20 million Americans are addicted to alcohol and or other drugs of abuse. The most commonly used drugs in the United States are alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana. I think by common sense, a lot of you would figure that. Across the country, there's over 15,000 different treatment programs, and they provide treatment to about 1 million people every year. If you look at the relapse rates for a lot of major illnesses, they can be 70, 80%. If you look at the relapse rate for substance use disorder, it's between 40 and 60%. So somewhere, give or take, around 50% following treatment that people will be able to stay clean and recover. So that does mean a lot of people relapse, but it also means a lot of people are successful. And for those people who are not successful on a first treatment, we definitely encourage that if more treatment's necessary, we should continue to provide it, just like we would with other illnesses. This is some drug usage statistics. Now, these are updated every couple of years. Again, this information is from SAMHSA, who does a national survey of drug use. And this is just one of the questions they asked on their survey. So they ask several thousand people a bunch of questions. One of those questions is, have you used any legal drug in the past month? Now, in this case, because we're doing a federal survey, that would include marijuana. It would also include cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, any other illegal drugs, so not alcohol. And you might be interested to know that about 89% did not use an illegal drug. About 11% did. So for every 9 people, every 9 adults in the United States, about 1 has used an illegal drug in the last month, and about 8 of those 9 have not. They also break down drug use by age group, and if you go to their website, which is actually really interesting, if you're into the data, you can find all kinds of information, breakdowns by drug of abuse, and you can look at historical trends as well. On this picture, you can see how many people in each age category had used that particular drug within the last month, so in the last 30 days before they were asked. So it starts with that 12 to 17 kind of teenage age group, then the young adult 18 to 25, and then the 26 and up. So those are the 3 breakdowns. And so you can see the rates for alcohol use, which are actually down for our adolescents over the past 20 or 30 years. You can see the rates for cigarette use, which are also down quite a bit. And then interestingly, you can see the rates for marijuana use, which for that middle tier, that young adult group, they're basically equal, cigarettes and marijuana. And it's likely marijuana now, over the last few years, has actually overtaken cigarette smoking. And then you can, just for comparison, see the rates of cocaine use, which are typically around 1% or lower. And then to conclude this first unit presentation, I want to talk a little bit about the opioid problem and how we got where we are. So just looking at a short window there, 2006 to 2012, it's estimated that 76 billion opioid pills were distributed in the United States. Now that's an enormous number. There's certainly a lot of people who use opioid prescriptions appropriately and who benefit from them. I don't think we need to go so far as to say opioids should be outlawed. However, we have to look at why we have such a huge number there and what's going on. Is it with the doctors, with the pharmacies? Is it with societal acceptance? How can we address this so that this problem doesn't continue to happen and doesn't happen again in the future? During that period, 2006 to 2012, in the United States, we experienced 100,000 overdose deaths. So that's just way too many people to be losing. In 2017, 11 million people misused an opioid prescription. Not all of those will necessarily have an addiction, but they're putting themselves at risk for some kind of harm and for possible overdose. Just looking at the historical trends here, the opioid overdose deaths, in 1999, we experienced in the United States about 8,000 overdose deaths. So that's already way too many. But by 2017, that had gone up to almost 50,000 in just 1 year. And that was opioid deaths alone. The total drug overdose deaths that year were almost 80,000. Overdose has now become the leading cause of death for people under age 50. So again, this is a public health problem that we have to take seriously, and we have to try to figure out how to stop it now as well as in the future. So this concludes the first set of slides, and going forward, you're going to see more slide presentations like this, and hopefully, like I said, it will complement the information you're seeing and help bring some of the ideas to life.